We're live. Welcome everyone to the APPN stream, our session today on artificial intelligence in healthcare, human versus machine. Thanks for joining us. Hopefully you've navigated through the tech troubles. We're delighted to have you with us with so many exciting sessions going on. My name is Paul Kidman. I'm currently doing a HEE Topol Digital Fellowship on digital self-referral. I've been in advanced practice physio for many years. I'm clinical and service lead for Camden MSK CATS at UCH. We will be joined in a second by our fantastic moderator, Anil Rubio. She's the AHP Information Officer and a very experienced APP at Frimley Park, and is also the APPN Digital Officer. So AI is a term I think many of us in MSK are hearing a lot at present. But it is complex, and while some of you may have detailed knowledge, it's a bit opaque to many. And given the explosion in digital healthcare the last year, the buzz around expectations for routine use in some services, Anna, I and Ben Wanless, who's also on the panel today, organised this event because we believe we need scrutiny of the potential benefits, but also the risks and the challenges and the philosophies behind these AI technologies. We'd really like this to be the start of a national conversation on the implications of the introduction and use of AI in healthcare. And we've got plans for more events and other forms of discussion, including a focused symposium at Virtual Physio UK in November with another absolutely top-notch panel. So please watch this space. But our fantastic panel today, providing insight and exploring some of the issues, are Helen Robson, who hopefully will be joining in a second. She is the Clinical Integration and Transformation Lead at Connect Health. She's a practicing APP and current Honorary Chair of the NE CSP Regional Network. She's also a fellow Topol Digital Fellow, working on a project of digitally enhanced clinical consultation. She's a published co-author on the effectiveness of community MSK physio and EQ5D outcome measures, and a member of the NICE Guideline Development Committee for hip, knee and shoulder replacement. Next up, we've got Grinbergs. He's a physiotherapist and serial entrepreneur and a founding member of the World Health Organization and International Telecommunications Union AI for MSK Health Topic Group. And most specific to today, he is the founder and chief medical officer of EQL.ai, who developed the product Theo Access, which is currently available to over 10 million people in the UK and powers Connect Health's Physio Now solution, which is something Helen played a key role in implementing. We also have Anil Mistry, currently a clinical scientist in artificial intelligence, working as part of a newly formed AI team at Guy's St Thomas's Hospital. They're introducing AI tools into normal clinical use throughout the hospital. They assess and deploy commercial AI solutions and build AI models in-house. And Anil is another Topol Digital Fellow, aiming to automate the monotonous bits of radiotherapy and introduce better data mining for R&D and incorporate AI into treatment planning. A final panelist is Ben Wanless, consultant physiotherapist at St George's University Hospital in London. Ben's a particular interest in the role of technology in healthcare, person-centered care, self-efficacy and exercise, and he's been digital AHP lead in 2 London teaching hospitals and implemented several digital health solutions. He's on this year's cohort of the Digital Health London Fellowship, and if that wasn't keeping him busy enough, he's also doing a PhD on the acceptability of self-management interventions for MSK conditions. So I'm just checking if Helen's managed to join us. I think she's still having tech trouble. So Pete, maybe if we come to you first.
Sure.
You're developing and selling digital projects, and obviously you're a known proponent of artificial intelligence. And from your perspective, I'd say it's absolutely rosy. So how ready are patients for this new level of technology?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I guess the way I look at this is, you know, at the end of the day, patients are people, and people are already experiencing and interacting with AI in most other aspects of their life. So if you're shopping online, if you're buying a pizza, if you're looking for love, you will be interacting with an AI. So I think people are ready, are willing to accept that it offers a lot of advantages when it comes to things like accessing healthcare, interacting with healthcare clinicians, being part of a journey that enables you to do more as a person, as a patient, and take more control over your health. And I think, particularly with the results that we're seeing, and hopefully Helen will attest to this as well, I think we are seeing that people are willing to accept and are willing to engage and are comfortable in interacting with computer technologies in order to better their healthcare experience.
Sure, yeah. I mean, obviously there's that level of acceptability, how they feel about it ethically, and their trust and so on. But what about the issues of digital exclusion, connectivity and so on? Is that an issue, do you think, as well?
I mean, of course it's been an issue this morning, connectivity, but yeah, absolutely it's an issue. I think the thing you have to be able to do is you have to design systems that, are, as an entry point, as a first port of call, are available and accessible to the vast majority of people. And we spend a lot of time, we obsess over that kind of that user experience and making sure that our systems are intuitive, are interactive, are understandable. But I think the thing that is key is that you don't rely exclusively on that technology. You should never exclusively rely on technology. You should always have the ability for people to interact with a service in an alternative way. And I think whilst we're keen to position our solution as a digital first technology, not least because the results that we've had, 30% of people accessing our platform in the middle of the night or over the weekend, a very broad age demographic. So right from 18 years old up to 94, even with some of our users. I think it shows that actually, if you are not lazy with the way you design your system, if you design a platform which is really looking at being addressable to all, I think you can overcome a lot of those issues. But you absolutely have to be cognizant of the fact that not everyone's going to want to interact with a platform in this way. You must have alternatives that people can quickly gain access to via alternative means. And I think it's only then that you can really be fully inclusive and offer a service which is truly accessible to all. But we've done a lot of work with Helen and the guys over at Connect to look at things like health literacy, testing our systems down to a reading age of 7 in certain areas. And I think the big thing about tech and using data and looking at data is that actually you can understand a lot from looking at the users that you've had, the people that you've had coming through. And I think you have to be aware of the need to continually improve, to continually query and question the data that you're getting back, and to look for improvements. And I think it's only then that you can be on top of and keep ahead of the potential issues that people might have, or the concerns that people might have. And as a software developer, we're always looking at ways to further increase access into our platform, whether that's through a text interface or a voice interface or whatever it might be.
Yeah, sure. And Helen's actually managed to join us, so I might pop to Helen and then we'll probably come back to you, Pete, in a sec, if that's all right. Helen.
Apologies for my tech failures this morning.
Yeah, no problem. You're not the only one. That's no doubt about that. So I think one of the issues we should address is probably the definition of what AI is in relation to the realities of clinical practice. To put it into context, could you summarize your experiences of the use of AI in your workplace?
Yeah, so I think there's two different contexts that I think we need to think about AI in healthcare. There's the use of automation and the use of robotic processing. And then there's the use of AI in its pure sense, which is around the deep learning and the machine learning that we can get from it. That's kind of my take on it. I don't believe in the physical world anyone at the moment is currently in the place of using the deep machine learning within AI at this point in time. So the way that we kind of have started to integrate robotics is we've got what we call robotic process automation, shortened to RPA, and it handles a lot of our patient registration. So when a patient referral comes in on electronic referral system. The robots know what fields to look for. They register it across into our patient access unit, which is system 1. They also move the patients around in the units. So, for example, when we're using Physio Now, when we get a return from Physio Now, the robots actually place the patients into the right place on our system. So if they need an appointment, they'll place them there waiting for an admin member of staff to contact them. If they've triggered a NHS 111 or urgent outcome, they'll move them to a clinician urgent list. And we also use robots to do discharges for simple conditions, so they don't do onward referrals to kind of secondary care, but things where we're writing a letter back to the GP, an action plan to the patient, and we've got standards, then the robots process that. So that's how we're kind of using robots at the moment. We're not using it within our Physio Now decision tree and algorithm, but it is something that we're hoping to use working with Pete and Equal in the future. Is it something that we'd be expected to be piloting within some parts of the decision tree within the next 6 months, hopefully? Yeah. I think that would be a really nice leap forward and an important progression.
Thanks. Do you have any expectations or even plans at your work for other developments for AI, uses of AI in MSK Physio generally?
So I think it's such an emerging field. We have nothing absolutely set in stone, but I think where I'm quite lucky, I'm in a role in an organisation that's quite happy to experiment and try things. I think putting it into Physio Now was probably the first thing. That algorithm is human based at the moment, and humans make error. So there is benefits of trying to keep it updated with the AI, and they will all, the other benefit of AI is it will give us a predictive diagnosis. So that is an interesting way that we can consider it moving forward. So if the AI is accurate enough to give us a predicted diagnosis, there's all sorts of things that we could do. I'm not saying we will do, but we could do things like build triggers into the clinical system. So, for example, let's say that AI suggests it's rotator cuff related shoulder pain, and through the deep learning that it gets back from our outcomes and resources back into it, if let's say the average number of treatment sessions for that is 4, and the different interventions are usually a combination of 3, then it gives us the opportunity that, right, okay, if we're on more than 4 and someone's using a different intervention, we could put triggers in the system to ask, are you doing the right thing? To pick up that someone's deviating from a usual pathway. Now, there's obviously benefits and pros and cons of deviating from a usual pathway because we have a patient at the center of it. So, but I think it's really interesting how we could use them. They could do all sorts of clever stuff in the future, but I definitely think we're at our early stages of exploring what they can do.
Yeah, thanks. That's great context, because I think it's very easy to see AI as this kind of slightly scary, taking over, making us redundant technology. So we're really talking there about kind of clinical support tools, aren't we? And leveraging those probabilistic models to assist rather than to take over. That probably brings us quite nicely back to you, Pete. Could you just talk us through a little bit about what you've got in development at EQL?
Yeah, so I mean, we're heavily interested in developing models, with prototypes for models that are capable of a much higher degree of reasoning. So using more probabilistic approaches rather than this more deterministic model that we have in place at the moment. And I think that's a really interesting and exciting area that we are exploring pretty heavily. And as Helen said, this idea that, I don't get scared by technology. I look at technology for healthcare professionals. It's not a new thing. People have been using technology for millions of years, and in healthcare for a very long time. It's a way of improving and enhancing your practice. And so we're always keen to develop tools that can do that, can unleash the potential for clinicians, can make their lives, or not make their lives easier, but inform their practice more. And I think we're very interested in exploring ways of being able to harness big data sets using, vast knowledge entities that can be epidemiological data, clinical experts, literature and learning. And we're very interested in incorporating that into our triage solutions, but we're also heavily invested in looking at some of our treatment interventions and how we can use deep machine learning to understand better protocols and how a pathway could be enhanced through the acquisition of data and by getting insight from that pathway.
Sure, yeah. I mean, we'll definitely come back to that. I think Ben in particular might have a few comments on, you know, things to discuss on that front. But could we move to Anil? Anil, you've got obviously a lot of technical know-how and experience in AI. Could you give us your insight, Anil, into other areas of healthcare where there's been AI success stories? And maybe briefly just talk about how those are kind of validated.
Yeah, sure. So so thank you for letting me talk. It's great to hear all the other views on AI and how they pertain to different aspects of primary care specifically as well. My experience is mainly in secondary care, and obviously we have a lot of our projects based around imaging, mainly because the data sets that are big enough to train algorithms, and where you can make some of the biggest differences through radiology and analyzing images. So there's a range of different products out there, mainly around diagnosis and spotting incidental findings. So say you have a chest CT that's come in for a pneumothorax, you can then double check that for you know, lung nodules, pulmonary embolisms, for other things. And often you have radiologists who should be able to report this, but the rate of reporting some of these, for instance, lung nodules, can actually be quite low. So a big success story is when there's a lot of companies out there trying to implement almost like lung screening, in a way, lung cancer screening. So it's fantastic. And across imaging, you have MRI, you can combine with MR, CT, PET, being able to have systems which feed into, which take in all these images and output diagnoses, essentially will be a pipeline within the hospital where everything gets sent to this pipeline, and analysis can be performed on one image for loads of different reasons. Yeah. In terms of validation, you need biggest large data sets to ensure that you're to ensure that you're not feeding in to ensure that any products you buy are the populations that the algorithms have been training on, the data doesn't have any bias within it. So it's a big issue for us, actually, trying to ensure that we have you know, the data sets there and readily available to do clinical evaluations. There's something called the NHSX Award, which I'm sure some of you may have heard of, where successful companies can bid for large amounts of funding to have a clinical evaluation in multiple trusts. For instance, taking on this, there's a couple of companies looking at lung nodule spotting, and to validate these algorithms, yes, they may say, you know, it works 99% of the time, but to have a clinical evaluation over a couple of years costs a lot of money. Yeah. And some of these companies aren't necessarily able to absorb that cost. So the NHSX is providing funding for them to do this across 10 sites and implement it and have it run alongside the normal routine workload to ensure that it does what it says on the tin.
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, that's a great solution to one of the challenges. Could you perhaps expand a bit on any other major challenges you've experienced or you know are aware of?
Yeah, so as I said, I mentioned briefly, some of the biggest challenges for us is making sure our algorithms that we create in-house, or the ones that we're buying in, don't have any inherent biases where they can end up being perceived as racist. So one of the biggest problems for us at the moment is as working in secondary care, most of the people that we interact with don't stay overnight and maybe are only single cases for one day maximum, and we may not get the data for their ethnicity straight off. So we're looking at around only 60% of our patients, up to, you know, for any particular data set, will have the ethnicity provided. And this is a big thing for trust. If we create an algorithm or implement a solution which has a known bias, as long as you know, you can figure out how to mitigate against that. But if you don't know the bias, that's a huge issue.
Yeah, sure.
And another big issue for us especially for the way that my team work, is that we go to a group of clinicians, for instance, radiology, and ask, what solutions do you need and what do you think could be solved with AI? Is that often they're not trying to solve a problem. You may have a really interesting product which does something fantastically, but there's no actual clinical problem behind it. For instance, there's no bottleneck, or there's no real issue with timings, and maybe a task is only taking 15 minutes, but you only do it twice a week. And if you're asking us to build something which will take us months to implement, and you're saving you half an hour a week from one clinician, where's the worth in that? So there's some of the routine stuff within our work that is challenging.
Sure. So you're striking a tricky balancing act from a kind of business case perspective, a clinical effectiveness perspective, a safety and a infrastructure perspective as well. I think we can't really discuss AI without probably touching on significant failings. I think it would be really good to hear. I think you've got a couple of good anecdotes about significant failure of AI projects.
Well, yeah, it's challenging because this is a very new field, and there's a huge pressure to bring it quickly into clinical environments, but there's inherent risks with installing anything. I mean, we have within our pediatric hospital, there's been a time when there was I think it was a couple of years ago actually, we had a product which looked at bone aging in pediatric patients, but below a certain age, you don't necessarily look at the carpal bones within hands, because there's a misnomer for the aging process. And quite a lot of the way the algorithm works was essentially a lookup where you'd analyze an image and then compare it to an X-ray within some data set, some encyclopedia. But when we implemented it, the clinicians complained that within the first 6 months, it was actually quite wrong. The issues, they had no confidence in it, but it turns out the clinicians were wrong themselves in that they didn't. There was people didn't necessarily remember the carpal bones, couldn't necessarily be used. So it was where the AI actually overtook the clinicians at one point. That was quite an interesting one. Yeah. It was the back and forth there. I mean, and then there's also, I mean, this is not particularly healthcare, but it's latching onto the racist AI. There was a time, I don't know if people saw it recently on Twitter, where if you post a picture and it crops the picture to focus on a particular, essentially what the interesting part of that image is. When you had non-white people in this photo, it was actually focus on a different part of, often skipping the face and stuff. So this is the training sets that Twitter were training their algorithms on were inherently biased and couldn't handle darker skin tones. So that was an interesting recent one where AI, luckily there was no clinical implication there, but that's the sort of stuff we want to avoid.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. I mean, we need to move on to Ben. I'm very conscious of time. Ben, obviously, if we can overcome some of those hurdles, which if we're alive to them, we should be able to. AI theoretically can deliver these fantastic improvements in efficiency, predicted care response, imaging accuracy. Why shouldn't we be investing absolutely all of our money into AI to get it off the ground ASAP?
Thanks, Paul. Well, firstly, I probably would question that first part of fantastic improvements in efficiency, because I certainly haven't seen any published or even unpublished data about this. It is quite speculative at this stage. And I'd probably go one further and ask, particularly if we move from a decision tree to a more kind of deep learning, machine learning model, what assurances do we have that these machines have learned enough to make decisions for us? Helen spoke about potentially building in some predictive diagnosis earlier, but again, I haven't seen any evidence of this, particularly in the MSK field. So I guess we should take a slightly more cautious stance, and that's perhaps the biggest point here. But actually my biggest concern with AI-driven triage is it takes away the patient's story. So at the moment, they're fed through a systematic, predetermined set of questions. which we're not therefore allowing the patient to tell their story. We also lose the human element of that, you know, the value of face and body language, human touch, all those types of things. So I suppose there's this assumption that AI will improve efficiency, but actually some people need to talk to a human, and they can be managed really well within that consultation, and that's all they need. And then they can get on with their life and self-manage their condition. So it's really, there's more questions, I guess, that I have, leaving IG and safety and bias aside, because on their own, they're massive topics. But I would just urge clinicians and policymakers to really ask themselves, should we embrace it? And is it the right thing to do at this stage?
So are you also talking perhaps a little bit about the acceptability side of it, you know, the trust in the technology? If you don't really trust it, you're not perhaps going to be able to tell your story, or you know that you can't tell your story and you therefore lose faith in it.
Yeah, sure. And actually the evidence we have so far with adoption of healthcare tech is fairly poor compared to other areas of life. I often get asked, so everyone's using their phones for social media and all sorts, so why aren't we encouraging them to use it for healthcare? But healthcare is different. Social media adoption is driven by social and cultural factors and pressure, or peer pressure and all those types of things. Healthcare is completely different, and actually as a society we are still quite private about our healthcare. The best evidence we have is that people will more likely use it if it's recommended by a clinician. But then we also know that clinical acceptability is variable. So we've got to think about both the clinicians accepting it and patients accepting it. You know, and I'm someone who's very pro innovation and adopting things. We've been early adopters within our trust, but we've got to consider the rest of the people, because that's only a small proportion of people who will do that. The other thing to say is that if we move to a point where clinicians aren't involved, as in, you know, we're giving these tools up front to people before they even get involved with a clinician, we have got to, as you quite rightly said, we've got to explore what are the reasons people don't use these tools. There was an interesting finding in a study a couple of years ago out of France as part of the Compare research cohort. There was about 1,000 people, but some quite interesting stats that out of those 1,000 people, only 20% of them said that the benefits of AI tools outweigh any of the dangers and risks that we've discussed. And actually 35% of those people would point blank refuse in using those types of things. So I think that needs to be explored.
Sure. Do you feel that there is perhaps an elevated level of concern when we're talking about AI versus other digital technologies, or are we really talking about them all in one pot?
Well, that particular study was a mixture, and there didn't seem to be any difference between AI and the other tools. I think, you know, we within healthcare get confused by the difference. I think the public do as well. There probably is a heightened kind of anxiety when we talk about true AI, certainly. And that's our job really, isn't it, as a community, to debunk some of those myths. And that's really why we're here today, I guess, to kind of help with that. But I do think we just need to think about it a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to quickly, before we move to Q&A, just touch back on the motivations for using it. I mean, if you're motivated to go and pay a bill in your bank through a digital tool, why would you not be that keen to use an AI-driven digital health tool?
Again, it comes back to the privacy around your healthcare. You know, yeah, it's probably right to think that people be have the same level of kind of thoughts and privacy around their financial data, but interestingly, healthcare does seem to be different. But again, they're the types of things you need to ask people. Why? Because some of those questions we don't know. Why do people use banking apps and not use healthcare apps? And I suppose the other thing to say is that banking, you're using it all the time. Finance is on everyone's mind every day. In healthcare, unless you've got a persistent long-term health condition, you will only be using these types of tools every now and then. Particularly in MSK, we've got a huge proportion of patients who get transient, sporadic, occasional symptoms. The long-term condition people, persistent pain, particularly in MSK, osteoarthritis, they might be a different cohort. But the vast majority of people, they get an MSK problem, it's sorted within 3 months. So we're asking them to kind of dip in and dip out of these types of things.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. I think we're moving to Q&A now. Anna, do we have any good questions for the panel?
Hey, Paul and everyone else. Anna's having some technical difficulties still, so I'm going to step in for the Q&A. We have had a few questions come in, so let me just bring them up. They're voted to the top. So first question to anyone who wants to take it on the panel. Does anyone see a role for AI in student placements to support their clinical reasoning? Not to replace a mentor, but to add a layer of support.
Helen, that could be a good one for you. Would you be able to?
I mean, I think there's stuff out there already, isn't there? So there's Respiratory Buddy and all sorts of stuff that's not AI, but it's algorithm kind of decision support tools. And I think that that was seen to be invaluable when clinicians were redeployed to respiratory who hadn't been there for 10 years and all those kind of things. So then, that's physio written, physio driven. So there's stuff out there from a decision support tool point of view already, and I think that's an easy place to sit in. From an AI point of view, I see no reason in the future if you use AI to help with your, kind of building your clinical picture, but it is really in the decision support world rather than driving the treatment and driving the management. I think probably the one thing I say is, and it kind of goes back to Ben's point, there's always a person in this, and I think one of the key things that physio offers is our ability to be compassionate humans, and we know that compassion makes a massive difference in that. And I think whilst I'm a massive promoter of technology, AI, I really believe that there is a place for it in the future. I don't think we can take away the benefit of human interaction, particularly for complex problems and patients with long-term conditions. So as a support tool, yes, I think it has a place.
Brilliant. Ben, any thoughts?
I'd completely agree. It's just a modern version of what we all had, I guess, when we were training in students. We'd get our book open and we'd look at it. You could argue that the whole Maitland concept was built around just giving you, and Mackenzie, all of it was very algorithmic. Okay, they've got this. Okay, I'm going to do this. So if we can modernize that, I think it's great. But if we can wrap around, supervision with clinicians as well, then absolutely.
Brilliant.
Shall I go to the next question?
Yeah, thanks, Nick.
So this one came in from Matt Wyatt, who attended Nadine Foster's Lancet Low Back Pain and the NICE Knowledge Clinical Summary session this morning. And the statement is that closing the research to practice gap is really vital. How do we see, how can AI support this or aid this?
I guess that could go to any one of you, really.
If I could step in, So
yeah, please,
I hopefully this is relevant. This is a big problem. We find that a lot of PhDs and research they create these fantastic algorithms which may do some wonderful work, but the leap from that to implementing into the clinical workload is huge. It doesn't often happen, if ever, mainly because one, you don't necessarily have the data to train to make sure that the population in which the original thing has been trained on can be trained on can be verified within the population that the hospital wants to use it on. There's infrastructure issues. There's processing power. There's also oversight as well. You don't want these models to be left alone. You have to monitor it, and this is essentially an entire team's workload. Fortunately, I mean, this is a shameless plug of our team. It's what we're trying to do. We're a newly formed team where you have dedicated clinical scientists into implementing what could be research or other products, and we manage that for an entire trust. It's a new team, and hopefully we are aiming to maybe create a model of how this team would work in any individual trust, or even extending out to the primary care area as well.
Brilliant. Pete, how have you experienced that, implementing research into the tech development?
Well, it's a pivotal part of the process, is obviously, I mean, particularly the way that we're looking at developing models, plugging in research is a key part of that. But kind of to Anil's point on bias, and there is a lot of inherent bias, even just in studies that are currently available, not least because they tend to be small sample sizes a lot of the time. So we always take an approach where it's, yes, looking at evidence, but we like to look at it as kind of evidence informed to a certain extent. So we take the evidence, we take expert opinion, we look at production data to see whether or not it matches what is expected. We create synthetic data to test. So there's a whole remit of stuff that you can use and should use in order to be able to kind of get to your starting position. But then very much it's about monitoring that in a real world environment. And yeah, there is work to be done there to be able to justify that and demonstrate that clinical significance and that clinical validity. But it all comes down to the way you design it. And I think there are ways of implementing AI that are interpretable, and that's key. And there are ways of implementing AI that are completely uninterpretable. And I think, as I think someone mentioned already, that there aren't any real good use cases for where you can't interpret an AI model, i.e. you can't look inside it and see what's going on. But there are ways of doing it where you can interrogate the process that took place and see whether or not that process was accurate. And I think it's key to take approaches that obviously follow more of that approach. At least that's kind of our view on it.
Sure. I mean, Helen, this probably comes back to what you were talking about earlier with the kind of the prompts and the pathway monitoring, so to speak. Do you see AI as able to bridge the research to practice gap?
I think so. I think it comes back on how the AI is built and how they plan on feeding research in as well. So, it's which databases do you plug your AI into? What triggers do you put so that it's updating? And again, as Pete says, how does, what triggers do you put in your AI or in your human in feeding your AI to make sure that data is relevant to go in? But yeah, I see no reason why it shouldn't plug that gap. It should be able, as time goes on, to be able to handle the massive data sources and bring it forward, quicker than we as humans can read articles and then influence others to change practice. So I think the prompts, like that, are going to be a useful kind of way of changing mindsets as time goes on.
Ben, I wonder, is there a little bit of a risk there, and you probably have more knowledge than me on this, but if you're using a learning model, a machine learning model, is there a risk that your model gets very good at doing what your data tells you is happening and is very focused and not alert to the developments of the wider research base?
Absolutely, and this goes back to bias, doesn't it? We know that data sets are biased. Any data you're pulling into an AI system from research, and this answers the bit about the wider research, actually, you could say the whole wider research world is quite biased. We have very tight inclusion criteria. It tends to be, particularly in the UK research, it tends to be 18 to 65-year-olds, they're white, they're professional. And so if we build our data sets and our evidence on that, we miss other parts of society that we know are already getting missed. And then perhaps going one further than that, because remember that there's lots of options that have been tried to be put in to answer this. So the fact, there's the nice clinical knowledge summaries. I think the BMJ do a similar version. They try to do something in our trust. No one does it. I would say we dilute it a little bit if we're not reading the research. I know there's loads and it's overwhelming, but actually there's so much value in reading that research as opposed to just getting something and saying, right, this is what you should do. And so I think AI can augment it, supplement it, but it's got to be mindful of the biases that exist. We all need to come up with a solution for that, but we also need to sit back and go, do you know what? We still need to think, we still need to clinically reason. And we make it too difficult for ourselves. We put all of our clinicians under far too much pressure just to get through patients and numbers, and don't give them space to think and clinically reason about what they're trying to achieve. And that's why we start coming up with these solutions. So I think they're important, but we've got to think about the other things as well.
100%. Nick, have we got any more questions?
Yeah, there's a couple more. I don't think we're going to get through all of them, so I'm going to be a bit picky now. So one of the questions, kind of in summary, is that AI is fundamentally different from other tools in our toolboxes, such as imaging, pharmacology, exercise, and how they work. So how, if a patient asks about how AI or ML has come to a decision, can clinicians confidently say they understand that? How can you see into the black box of AI and explain that to patients?
I'll happily pick that up. I don't think it is fundamental. I mean, the first point is I don't think it is fundamentally different, would be my first position. You send the patient for an MRI scan. Okay, it's not like you take verbatim what the MRI scan says. You use that as part of your knowledge set because you can't look inside the body and understand what's going on. So you opt for a technology that can give you more insight. And I think ultimately that's how I see AI being used. It is a technology at the end of the day that can add some value into the process. I think in terms of about the question around how do you know if it's come to a decision, that's the whole point about you have to create systems that are interpretable. There are ways of developing AI solutions that are completely uninterpretable. So they have this closed black box approach where they have data being fed through and no one can look into it and understand why a decision's been made. That's one way of developing an AI, but that's not the only way of using it. And I think there are models that you can take and approaches you can take. And even with ML and deep machine learning, there should always be an element of approving and approving the process that's been created and then submitting that into the build, say, or into the new model, without an automated model which is continually updating itself and doing continual iteration, which actually, given the regulation, you can't actually deploy a system that continually updates itself without any sense checks going on in that process. So it's actually not possible to deploy a solution like that at the moment. And I think that the key is that there are humans involved in the decision-making process to check the quality of the data and make sure it's valid before they are being obviously subjected to a release into a kind of live environment.
Can I add that just very briefly? I think the other thing that we need to ensure that we do with any bit of new technology, whether it be AI or not, that we're employing to patients that's going to interact with them, and clinicians need to be aware of it. It's the clinician readiness piece, it's the clinician education piece, it's the involvement of clinicians as well. So I think, if anyone introduced AI and no one's explained to the clinicians how it's going to work, how it's going to impact, then we're setting our clinicians up to fail. So I think that's a really important piece that we all need to be ensure that we're on top of when we're releasing this type of tech.
Brilliant. Yeah, I mean, we're running out of time now, but Ben, one of the elements of that was the communication, the explanation to the patient. Do you have any insight into, how effective that is?
How effective what? Our explanation of AI is? Yeah,
well, and digital tools, I suppose we should expand it to.
I have no nuggets of how to explain that to patients, apart from you've got to talk people through it. And from a practical point of view, sometimes, and this is where the whole kind of, do you deliver it via clinicians spending time to show them the tech? But that's that big field of let's understand what patients need and how they use this. Explainable AI is something that I'm really kind of pro and keen to do, but there is that kind of balance, isn't there, between what I've heard, not necessarily in healthcare, is that you get better results with the stuff that is a bit more black box.
Sure. I think we're basically out of time, so I just want to thank everyone very, very much for your time and insight and expertise. It's been a really interesting discussion. I'd really like as many of the audience as possible to join us at Physio UK for a focus symposium on AI. We've got another great panel, and we'll be releasing some more discussion papers and so on through blogs and possibly other media over the coming months. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, others.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.